Okay, let's get started. And I think as if more people, I'll have to like once in a while, maybe interrupt a little bit to let somebody else in, but this way we can get going. And so today what I want to talk about is basically cholesterol. And, obviously this is a topic I've known something about for a long time, but I've listened to a series of podcasts, probably I'll bet about 10 hours of podcasts within the last month, and probably as many hours of reading about this. And it's really helped me to learn a couple of things. Number one, I probably didn't fully appreciate this to the extent that, certainly not to the extent that a lipidologist would understand it, since that is what all they study, but it's also helped just shed some light on some of my thinking about this. And I think the thinking has changed a bit even since I learned about this in my functional medicine training. So that's why I have chosen to dive more into this and take more time, just because I think it's super important. It's often misunderstood. The numbers that we've all been trained to look at and been looking at for many years, and that insurance says are important, maybe aren't as helpful as we think. And I think we all want to live as long of healthy lives as we can. So that's the idea. So this is going to be an update on cholesterol, and let's see if I can get this to, there we go. So objectives, I'm going to talk about like, what is cholesterol? We'll talk about what does cholesterol do? We're going to talk about lipoproteins. And so you will notice if you read different things, sometimes words get used interchangeably. How does it relate to heart disease? What numbers are important to know? And what can we do to kind of modify those risks, which are so important? So cholesterol is a waxy fat-like substance, and it's produced by all animals. You can see over here, like plasma being our blood plasma, there are lots of different lipids. And so we hear cholesterol and lipids. The one we're most commonly talking about when we talk about lipids, and you've heard me say lipids, is these sterols, and cholesterol is a sterol. So, and that has to do with these four rings and this oftentimes an OH right here. And so it's basically referring to the chemical structure. Most of the cholesterol that we have in our body is produced by our liver. Some of it comes from our food. So I think that's an important nuance to understand, because I think a lot of times we're told like, well, eat a low fat diet, like, I mean, I can think of 10 years ago, I would say, well, eat a low fat diet or eat a low cholesterol diet. And that doesn't really help anybody know what to do in terms of direction. And really a lot of this cholesterol, the majority, 80% thereabouts, is produced in our liver. So cholesterol is actually hydrophobic. So it fears water, and therefore it needs, which think about if you drop oil in water, olive oil in water, mineral oil in water, any oil in water, usually it stays in its little droplet form there. And so in order for any of these cholesterol particles or lipid particles to transport around our body, it needs a transport vehicle. There are really generally three. Our red blood cells can act as a transport vehicle, although it's not super efficient. Albumin, which is a protein in our bodies, can act as a transport vehicle. And then an apoprotein can act as a transport vehicle. And this is how we'll get into talking a bit more about like apoproteins, lipoproteins, and so you'll understand hopefully a little bit more about what does this actually mean. So before we dive into cholesterol and the makeup of these things, functions of cholesterol. So cholesterol is an essential part of cell membranes. It's in the cell membranes of every cell in our body. So it's super important. it also supports our hormone production. And a lot of you, if we've talked about hormones, we've talked about the fact that cholesterol is where we get our cortisol and our DHEA and our progesterone and our testosterone. So cholesterol is essential. It's also essential for vitamin D. It's essential for bile production and really essential for brain health and our nervous system, and basically that myelin sheath around our arteries, or I'm sorry, around our nerves, which is super important in terms of nerve transmission. The lipoproteins now are, so this is basically, a lipoprotein is a term that we're going to use kind of going forward. And so it's made up of phospholipids, it's made of triglycerides, and it's made of cholesterol. And so you can see cholesterol, these little teardrops are the cholesterol particles, the little blue dots are the triglycerides, and these green things, which we're going to learn are pretty important, are these apolipoproteins. And so this is the vehicle that basically transports this around, the cholesterol around in our body. These apolipoproteins basically help with structure and kind of the structural integrity of this lipoprotein. They can act as cofactors, they can act as in enzyme reactions, and also as ligands, or in other words, helping to bind with other cell receptors. So lipoproteins are made in the liver and small intestine from fatty acids that we eat. And when you think about fatty acids, think about basically our saturated fats, our unsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, those kind of things. This then leads us to the discussion of size and density of these particles, which we'll talk about. And so this apolipoprotein is basically a protein plus a lipid, which would be your cholesterol. So in terms of size and density, and we've talked a little bit about this, you know, I think that this is valuable to see for a couple of different reasons. Number one, so these ApoB lipoproteins, and the B portion of this really encompasses our LDLs. And so those are larger particles. These contain more triglycerides. As you can see, all this blue is triglycerides. And then the ApoA, those are really related to the HDL particles. And so that is super helpful in terms of thinking about what are we transporting in our bodies, and you know, really thinking about, and we'll talk a little bit about how does atherogenesis happen, how do we start to develop these plaques, and it has to do with these particles. These ApoB particles, I said cholesterol is made in our liver, so these ApoB particles are made in our liver mostly, and it's called the ApoB 100, but you probably won't hear that term as much, but ApoB is important. It is also, there's a smaller ApoB particle that is made in the small intestine. And you know, the other thing to notice is when you have these bigger ones and there's basically more triglycerides in here, we're really looking at how much protein versus triglyceride, and that will come into play here as we continue. So in terms of transporting the cholesterol, this was just a nice diagram just to show that the ApoB is the largest thing that transports cholesterol and triglycerides around our body. Red blood cells can do this a little bit, as can albumin a little bit, but basically things get transported from the liver, they go to the intestines, and then they're also ending up in peripheral cells. Super important that we have delivery of triglycerides and phospholipids, and I'll talk about how, those ApoBs often are delivering things to our muscles. And so this is just kind of the way the energy works, and things go both directions. So things also get returned back to our liver, which helps us with also eliminating cholesterol. So how does this all relate to heart disease? So if we have LDL particles that are floating, within our system, if we have, so this is basically an artery, and here's where your plasma and your blood is flowing through your artery. We have this single layer of cells in our endothelium. So, and those are called endothelial cells. And these line these arterial walls. And when we have really a high number of LDL particles, it will basically, as a gradient, can drive through. A key, though, is without any injury to these endothelial cells, it's really hard to develop a plaque or a problem in our arteries. So what causes this? So that would be various factors that would cause inflammation or injury to these. So high sugar diets can do that. High blood pressure and stress can cause problems with the endothelium. But so basically, the more particles we have, and if we have any injury here, we can end up with those particles being driven into those artery walls. And then that's where, I guess we'll say, bad things can happen, if you will. And trying to think, I guess one other thing that I want to talk about with relation to this would be these lipoproteins carry cholesterol and triglycerides throughout our body. And once they leave the liver, they actually start to mature, and they lose some of that triglyceride component, and they become smaller and richer in cholesterol. And so that's how, by their time, they're, the further they're going, they can become these little dense particles, and that can be more problematic. The ApoB function is really about transporting triglycerides into muscles and into the phospholipids of our lipid membranes. And ApoA1 generally traffics, and that'd be so kind of more of our HDL particles, traffics cholesterol to the steroid tissues, steroidogenic tissues, so tissues that need to produce steroids, as well as fat cells. Both of them, again, they'll recirculate things back to the liver, so we can then, dispose of things and break things down as need be. So in terms of, what kind of labs do we look at? And if we think about what a cholesterol particle is, and thinking about just those numbers and how important it is to have these carrier proteins in our body, when we start to look at what we usually look at in a typical cholesterol panel is we look at a total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, and then we look at some of these other these particles, the VLDL, the LDL, which you could see if I can go, let's see if I can go backwards. No, yeah, there we go. So, we're looking at VLDLs, LDLs, HDLs. We're looking at a number for these triglycerides, all these little blue dots. So those are the kind of things we're looking at. We're looking kind of for these particles. And now I really went backwards. There we go. And looking at just those numbers are a little bit limited. And so I want to talk a little bit about, what other things can we be measuring? And we're starting to measure these things. I'm finding that insurance is covering this sometimes. And I think it's helpful because how can we get a baseline of where we're at without these numbers, much less being able to know what to prevent going forward. So other important things that we can measure are lipoprotein A, and that in general can be a one-time test. It's an inherited marker. ApoB, as you can see, that apoprotein B, that's really reflective of our LDL portion or particles, and that is the most correlated with atherogenesis. The other that's really important is that LDL particle number. And so you'd think ApoB and LDL particle number could be used a bit interchangeably, but the caveat with LDL particle number is there's 3 different technologies used to measure this. And so there have been 2 different NMR technologies, as well as another a flow immunophoresis technology that they all will give you different numbers. So if we do an LDL particle number from one company, we may not get the same number from another company. So in one of these podcasts I listened to last week, both of these experts are recommending the apoprotein B because there's really one measuring technique. So for those of you, if we've done an LDL particle number in the past and we've done it consistently through SpectraCell, I think we have a good number. We also get an ApoB through that. If we've done followed LDL particle numbers through LabCorp, we're probably fine. But what I'm learning now is that if we get one at one lab versus another lab, that can be a whole different thing. In terms of HSCRP, that's really important, and I do that for a lot of you. And actually, CRP is just part of the panel that we're doing, and it's because I'm basically looking for inflammation. We also want to be looking at liver, kidney, and thyroid function, hemoglobin A1C, because we're thinking about metabolic risk and diabetes, as well as uric acid, homocysteine. So some other factors that we can look at for inflammation, look at as indicators of diet, and potentially even what our processing ability and methylations needs might be through homocysteine, which is also another marker of inflammation. So in terms of some of these latest guidelines, these come out of Europe, and you can see this one's a little, this is from 16, but this is also quoted in the 2019 guidelines. And really, a lot of it involves lifestyle advice, and then there are certain parts where we get to where we're really looking at lifestyle and considering drugs, and when we're thinking about what are the risk factors that you're thinking about, that's kind of those are age, and those are things that I plug in. Age, have you had heart disease before? Do you have diabetes? Do you have high blood pressure? Do you have kidney disease? Different things like that. So that would change your category level. So just in terms of what do some of these guidelines look like, and importantly, like ways to modify our risk of atherogenesis. And I think the number one thing to do is remember that it's a multifactorial process. So even if we have a high cholesterol or high ApoB or high LDL particle number, that alone is not going to drive necessarily your risk of developing plaques. Even if you have a high LP little a, which is that inherited marker, just because you have that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to develop heart disease. What's really important is thinking about, what things can we can't do much about our age. Men are higher risk than women. But really the 2 most important things, smoking and blood pressure, are our 2 largest factors. And so both of those can actually damage the endothelium. A bad diet can damage the endothelium as well. So really working on, our diet, and we've talked before about like Mediterranean diet, avoiding sugar, controlling diabetes, reversing diabetes, really important. And then we want to really work to reduce those ApoB and LDL particles. And a lot of that we can do through diet. We can also use omega-3 fatty acids to help us. We can use statins. There's another group of meds that's being used a little bit, PCSK9 inhibitors that's being used in real high-risk people right now. But, largely it's that exercise, and strength training helps our endothelium. All of those things will help us to modify that risk. And so, I think one of the big things that I want people to understand is that yeah, these cholesterol numbers are really important, but number one, we probably should be really looking at kind of ApoB, LDL particles. Triglycerides are helpful. Your total cholesterol is a little bit helpful, but we really got to know what sort of particles you have. And you can have a low total cholesterol, but if the vast majority of that is reflected in ApoB particles, there's still a great amount of reduction in risk that we can gain from lowering that. So super important that we really start to focus on these right, metrics, if you will. And I think we've been doing some of these things for a couple of years. And I think this is just helped me rethink this process and how important it is that we really are looking at this whole factor. And I think cholesterol has been, it's been given a bad rap. We've traditionally called HDL good and LDL bad. And it turns out that there's nothing that's good or, it's not a good, bad thing. It's a matter of what are we dealing with. And there have been several studies showing that even if we raise HDL cholesterol, that does not confer benefit in terms of prevention of heart disease. And I think, that's an important thing that has changed in the time that I have been studying this more. And over the course of my training, there was a point when we thought that increasing HDLs was a good idea. And it's not that it's not a good idea, but there is no end target benefit to basically increasing your HDL. So unfortunately, and then in summary, I want to be able to, hopefully this has made some sense. It's a complex topic, and as I listen through it and think through it, yeah, it's a challenge to try to explain it in a concise way. But hopefully you guys have gained a little bit of understanding of cholesterol, what is a lipoprotein, and how is this related to heart disease? What numbers do we need to know? And, what can we do in terms of risk reduction? I do have a couple of references here. A lot of the reference for this came through Peter Attia, MD, who is a physician and has a podcast and is overall just a super smart and inquisitive guy. So fun to follow if you're interested in cutting edge things. And a few other references here in terms of links on the internet that I got different information from.